Good evening, I'm Elaine Wilcox and welcome to the Granada debate. Coming up on the programme tonight, the fallout from this month's elections and just who should be more worried by the results. What needs to be done to improve maternity care after thousands of women are being left traumatised by childbirth. And a Wembley for the North at Old Trafford, but who should pay for it? Joining us for tonight's debate, we have James Daly, the Conservative MP for Bury North, Labour's Ashley Dalton, who's MP for West Lancashire, and Councillor Carl Cashman, who's leader of the Liberal Democrats in Liverpool. Good to see you all. Thanks for joining us this evening. So the Prime Minister has come out fighting after this month's bruising set of local election results and the surprise defection of MP Natalie Elphicke to Labour. Rishi Sunak kicked off the week with a pre-election speech where he set out his vision for the UK if the Conservatives remain in government. Meanwhile, this morning, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer detailed his first steps if he would take if his party wins the next election.
Here we are. One card, 6 steps, in your hand, a plan to change the country. This is a message that we can take to every doorstep across the country, and make that argument.
Well, the polls suggest Labour are on course to win, but does the clean sweep of the North West mayors, police and crime commissioners and a win in Blackpool by-election tell the whole story?
Labour Party, 10,825.
It was Blackpool rocks for Labour, with the biggest swing from the Conservatives since the Second World War. The Tories were almost pushed into third place in a by-election triggered by Scott Benton's lobbying scandal. Reform UK were just 100 votes behind them. But the cheers didn't extend to Oldham, where Labour lost control, with independents taking over. The party's former leader, who's now a Bolton councillor, says they've been on the rise in Oldham for some time.
It is the Gaza issue and the election of independents that has tipped the balance this year. And if somebody has an agenda, is in control of local WhatsApp groups or local Facebook groups, or has a big following on TikTok, they can really shape the debate.
Oldham losing a Labour seat because they haven't done nothing at all.
Oldham Council, they've run Oldham for a long time, and I blame much of the deterioration and retirement on them, and I think maybe people should give the independents a chance.
I'm not happy with the Labour, that's fine.
Why?
Because of the Gaza. Still fighting, it should be stopped.
It's interesting because I remember when people would say I'm Labour or I'm Conservative, it was part of their identity.
That's Paula Keaveney's takeaway from the North West results. The rise of ultra-local groups sweeping up the protest votes.
Our loyalty to parties has been fading for quite a number of years now, and this sort of creates a gap for independents. And we have seen a rise in independents or sort of locally focused independent type parties.
I voted for Conservative because I'm more interested in what's happening here and not what's happening in Gaza.
The Muslim community is a very important part of British society, and people must be heard. And as I said, if we lose support anywhere, what the Labour Party does is listen to people.
I didn't vote because nobody's worth voting for.
The North West re-elected mayors hope this will mean the rebuilding of the Red Wall, but they've both been around long enough to know voters vote differently in general elections.
So, James Daly, what have the last 2 weeks been like for you? Pretty bruising?
Never better. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to try my best. I'm sure my colleagues are going to be the same about not being too overly political about this. But if you look at the local election results and you then take the figures down into the parliamentary seats, which different parties have to win, I think there's some really interesting trends in this. So if you look at Pendle Council, for example, there are no Labour councillors on Pendle Council whatsoever. Pendle is a seat which has to be won at the general election. In Burnley, which is just about the most marginal Conservative seat in the country, Anthony Higginbottom, a brilliant local Conservative MP, was only 400 votes behind in terms of the share of the vote in the constituency. We've heard about Oldham, where Labour can't take control. Bolton, where they're going back from 28 to 26 councillors. So something is happening. And I think that in different parts of the northwest, different local issues are playing out. I don't think we should ever underestimate what one of the gentlemen said there, is that towns and places, wherever you're from, mean something. And if a town is not being run correctly, people can see it when they come out the front door. And some of the votes for independence are a reaction to how badly some town halls are being run.
I'll pick up in a second with you a bit later on Blackpool South, but Ashley, Blackpool was a must-win. Gaza still very much impacting. Are you dispirited, though, when you hear nobody's worth voting for?
Well, I mean, you know, I think when people do say that they don't think anyone's worth voting for, that's, you know, that's something that we really have to listen to make sure that we are listening to local people and getting our message across. I think what we did see in the local elections was that, you know, people were turning away from the Conservatives right across the country, not just in the northwest. They lost nearly 500 council seats, and we're turning to Labour. I mean, you know, Burnley, for instance, we did really well there. Hyndburn, in particular, we did pretty well in Hyndburn. So, you know, there is examples right across the northwest where Labour's done really well. The rise of independence, yeah, and in local elections, the independents and the smaller parties do traditionally do far better. I don't think anybody is suggesting for a moment that those results will pan directly to Parliament. Otherwise, we'd be looking at 60 independent MPs, and I think that's highly unlikely.
So, Carl, in the past, Liberal Democrats used to take that protest vote. How do you feel 2 weeks ago the results were for Liberal Democrats?
Well, I think they were fantastic, to be honest. We came second not only around the country, but in the northwest and in important places such as Preston and Stockport, we moved forward. And I went to Cheadle on election day to go and knock on doors there. And I went and knocked on a guy's door and he said, "Oh, great, Scouse." He said, "Get the Tories out." I said, "Yeah, fantastic. How are you voting?" And he said, "Lib Dem, of course." And I think to me that said three things. First of all, people are fed up with the Tories. Second, Labour aren't inspiring them. But third, in places like Cheadle and Hazel Grove, people know to get the Tories out, you need to vote for the Lib Dems.
People are fed up with the Tories. You heard it on the doorstep there. Blackpool South, not local election, a by-election. You've lost that red wall seat.
It's quite interesting when we look at the polls, and the polls would suggest, if they are correct, that the Labour lead is about 20 to something plus percent. If you actually, rather than looking at polls, if you actually take these elections as something that we can garner as to where people are. In my seat, which is a very marginal seat, Labour's lead over me was 6.5%.
A very, very slim majority, so you must be pretty worried.
Well, listen, if I was worried about my majority, I'd have had a nervous breakdown about 4 years ago. Do you know what I mean? It's nothing to do with that. All I'm trying to say is that we can't just. The easiest thing in the world is just to ignore these results and say they don't. You know, they don't extrapolate into anything. They do. You know, again, when we talk about Blackpool South, a very disappointing result. Now, it's a very low turnout. The Reform vote there presents a number of challenges for the Conservative Party. If we can squeeze that Reform vote in Blackpool at the general election coming up and place the choice as a straight choice between potentially the Conservatives and the Labour candidate, then I think we'll do very well in Blackpool at the next election.
Well, let's see. Well, Natalie, talking about Reform, you've taken on Natalie Elphicke, which, you know, some have said in the Conservative Party she's too right-wing for them. How does she fit with Labour?
Well, I think what Natalie Elphicke did was make it clear that you know, she's made that shift because she doesn't think the Conservatives are delivering for her constituents.
What job's she getting?
And that she's made that shift very carefully because she doesn't believe. Well, we don't know that. I don't know that. As far as I'm concerned, you know, there's no evidence of that whatsoever.
She did.
So I think it's a bit, you know.
She did call your leader Sir Softy. Has she apologised?
Sorry?
Has she apologised?
I haven't got the faintest idea. But, you know, if Natalie Elphicke thinks, as a Conservative, a previous Conservative MP, if she's prepared to say this Conservative government is not delivering for my constituents, but I think that the Labour Party can, then I think that gives an awful lot of confidence to Conservative voters out there that actually they can trust Labour and they can come to us.
OK, well, we'll leave that topic of the election for now. From the election, fallout to maternity care, and earlier this week the results of an inquiry into traumatic childbirth were published. The birth trauma inquiry heard evidence from 1,300 women, including many from the Northwest, who spoke of harrowing experiences, including life-changing injuries and being denied basic things such as pain relief. The inquiry called for a reform of maternity and postnatal care and a new maternity commissioner.
That moment when they were putting the mask on my face, I had got it in my head that I wasn't coping because I was dying. I thought I was dying. And there was just no information there. There was no support. There was no even just someone to talk to about what was happening with my body. I felt embarrassed. I felt ashamed. I felt like my body was failing me and no one was listening. No one was helping me.
We put our heart and soul into making this report. The people who've submitted their stories and the terrible things, the life-changing things that they've been through their adverse childbirth experiences. We have to hope that this does make a change because it's well overdue. And I heard a statement from the Health Secretary earlier, and it was somewhat sort of, we're doing all of this stuff already, and we are trying to make changes. But unfortunately, those changes aren't actually being rolled out, perhaps as they should be at this stage. So it needs to be something that is done nationally, and it is done as a matter of urgency.
Well, Jess Jones, as we heard there, was so traumatised by the birth of her son at Liverpool Women's Hospital, she was too frightened to have any more children. The Trust, which is held up as a centre of excellence, has apologised and are looking at what can be learned from the inquiry to improve their services. Here's what the PM said about the report at this week's PMQs.
I'm delighted that the Secretary of State and the NHS CEO both support the overarching recommendation for a comprehensive national strategy to improve maternity services. We will update the House on next steps in due course, but we are fully committed to improving the quality and consistency of care for women throughout pregnancy, birth and the critical months that follow.
So, James, we heard of commitment there, but terrible traumatic experiences for women. How have we got to this position?
Well, for many of us, this is personal as well as a political and practical issue. I have two children. During the birth of my eldest child, my wife lost a lot of blood. An emergency C-section was required. I remember that when my son was born, my wife was unable to hold him and was very poorly for a time. We were lucky in the position that we were able to try for a second child. 4 days before she gave birth, she had a TIA, which is a mini stroke, prior to that birth. And, it's very difficult in terms of putting myself in the position of somebody who's actually going through the physical act of giving birth. But as a family member who witnessed something like that, then pre and postnatal care is absolutely fundamental. And the one thing that we forget about this is that the consequences of what happens in that period, not only in terms of the lady who's giving birth, but potentially for the child, are lifelong. And therefore the investment that is required in the services before giving birth and after giving birth and the support that new mums need is absolutely fundamental.
So you had a very personal experience. What we're hearing is staff shortages, a lack of funding. Does that have to be addressed?
OK, I'll tell you that. Right. The £35 million is going in for further training and new maternity services. There's £186 million more of funding in maternity services than there was 3 years ago. When you read through the 1,300 people who were brave enough to take part in that, in the report, there were many, many reasons as to why things happened. And it's not fair or accurate to simply say with the statement that you've made. There are mistakes.
I'm saying, is it a factor?
No, I'm saying that everything. I'm saying that everything is a factor. What I'm trying to say is that we also have to take into account the issue of training, because individual mistakes can be made in this circumstance. Now, I think the report is a fantastic piece of work chaired by two of our colleagues, Theo and Rosie, who are great champions for this. But it's a much more nuanced question than just simply saying it is all about money. I would put as much money as is humanly possible, because this is the start of somebody's life journey, and that's important.
Ashley, what's your thoughts on this?
I mean, the report was really harrowing reading, and the stories that people have shared and been courageous enough to share are really moving. But, you know, it is appalling to read what some people have been through. And I think, you know, this hasn't happened overnight. We've had 14 years of Conservative government, and you know, nothing.
So is it a lack
and
of
it's got worse
not enough
and worse
midwives?
and
Is it
worse.
training or
It's a whole
culture?
host of things, and there's a list of recommendations in that report which we're looking at. Some of which are already Labour Party policy. So, for instance, recruiting more midwives, doing better training, making sure there's continuity of care, particularly through digitising health records and that sort of thing. And we're going to be looking at those other recommendations really closely to see what we could do.
Now, Carl, Liverpool Women's, this is where we had the dreadful situation there. It's held up as a centre of excellence. It must be very disappointing for you to hear that. What do you make of the recommendations?
It is disappointing, but you know, we can all be easily critical, and in these instances, you know, it's right to be critical, but at the same time, you know, these services are under massive strain, and I would say the main factor is underfunding for a very, very long time.
You absolutely do not know that.
What about...
That you don't know about the personal experience of what
factor.
people go through. Don't make a trite political point
How
in
is that a
respect of the
political
individual
point?
point. You
How
don't know
is
what's
that a
going on. You
political
don't know what's
point?
going on in terms of training in hospitals. You don't know the different
you know
things that
what's
are going
going
on.
on?
I've
know
been
what's
through
going
it.
on?
You haven't been through it.
If
And
you
so
can
just
let-
simply
How do I not been
to
through it?
simply throw out that it's all about money and not about anything else, I think
If I can
is
just
doing
ask
an injustice
Carl
to
a
this very
question.
serious problem.
That's the
Carl,
main
if I
factor,
can
and
ask
it
you a
is.
question about, in terms of not enough staff, how much of a factor is that the lack of a bursary, tuition fees for nurses and midwives, something that the Lib Dems supported?
Well, we
as in
didn't get rid of
tuition fees.
bursaries. That was when the Conservatives were in government on their own. So it's very clear to make that point. I think that nurses should get bursaries when they go to university. But if we get back to the actual story here, and that, you know, that lady's story is absolutely heart-wrenching, and I absolutely feel for her. My sister, and this is, you know, a nice story with this. She just become a new mother, and her experience was really, really good, and she went to Wiston Hospital. So I have to give a shout out to Wiston Hospital and some NHS practices around the country that are absolutely fantastic. I'm just really sorry that these same women haven't had the same experience. It's not acceptable.
Just very briefly on this topic, Ashley, what do you want to see happen now, today?
Well, obviously we've got the report. We need to look at those recommendations. We've already said, as the Labour Party, that we will bring forward some of those recommendations already. And that's what we would be doing if we're lucky enough to serve after the next general election. But I think, you know, the Conservatives need to take some responsibility for this because it's been on their watch.
The report says there is excellent practice going on throughout the country. The problem
there is.
it's a postcode lottery.
But we
so
heard
to make
exactly.
to make blanket statements in respect of this is not, in terms of the budgets, in terms of the services, hospitals, as we've just heard, are providing a fantastic service, but not all of them are, and we have to get to the heart of
But
that.
we've heard a commitment from
And
the Prime
5 the
Minister.
11th
I think that
to
postcode
change that.
lottery has got
I
nothing
don't
to
think
do
that's
with the government.
What the question that I want to have asked, if it is to do with the government, fine, but what I want to know is why that some places can provide an excellent service with the
Right.
same level of funding and others can't do it with the same level of funding. What's the reason for that? And that's all that I say in terms of looking at this on a hospital by a hospital basis. The hospital in Liverpool have apologised for some reason. If there's nothing to apologise for, they wouldn't be able to do that. I think that individual responsibility not only comes from the amount of money you put into something, but the level of training, the management and the service that women get in each individual hospital.
If I can just come in at this point,
Well, no, clearly, Ashley, but you think that everything in the world is the Conservative government's
I
fault.
thought James wasn't going to make this party political.
I
There's
need
no
to come at
occasion
this
for
point and say that what all women, pregnant women and parents want is a good birth everywhere at all
Absolutely.
hospitals. Now, to our final topic, and Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer was at Old Trafford at the weekend, and with storm clouds gathering literally and metaphorically over the stadium, the United owner Sir Jim Ratcliffe made his pitch to the potential new Prime Minister for his transformation of the stadium into the Wembley of the North. That vision has the backing of Mayor Andy Burnham, but can we justify using taxpayers' money to fund a club who makes vast profits? OK, well, can we?
No. It makes me laugh about Andy Burnham. I spent the first couple of years of my parliamentary life, as you know, because you interviewed me in respect of it, trying to persuade Andy Burnham and the Greater Manchester Combined Authority to support a financial package to save Gig Lane, which they did absolutely zero about. In terms of Manchester United and that ground, I'm sure the Glazers and Sir Jim Ratcliffe, with their billions, are able to do that rather than the taxpayer.
You might say it's levelling up. It's not the stadium, it's all the infrastructure around it. And we've seen elsewhere in the country lots of big sporting areas getting a lot of money.
That's exactly the argument that I put to the GMCA and to Andy Burnham regarding Bury, completely ignored. And therefore it was this government that had to provide the £1 million to save Gig Lane. We've now got a stadium which is a community asset, which is football is being played there. There are 2,000 or 3,000 people going through it there every other week. We didn't have the money in Bury to be able to do that without government support. So, you know, if Andy Burnham and others think that supporting billionaires to build a stadium when they can afford it is a good use of taxpayers' money, then good luck to them.
What's your view, Ashley? Is it something that you want to see support? Because some people might say, why is all this money when we're in a cost of living crisis? Why are we helping multimillionaires?
Well, I think, you know, whatever happens with Old Trafford, you know, it's got the potential to really reinvigorate the local economy and the local community, and that's a great thing. And I understand, you know, that, of course, Andy Burnham's going to support that in an appropriate way. You know, it's not, no one is suggesting for 1 second that government money should pay for the entirety of a stadium, but it is not uncommon with large capital build projects like this for taxpayers' money to be used to develop the surrounding infrastructure, because that's about saying we want to be able to develop this area and we want it to be able to impact positively on the wider community and on the wider economic environment. So, you know, I don't think it's too far off what normally happens anyway.
Carl, it could lead to jobs, but how will this go down in, say, Everton, Liverpool and, you know, City fans, for example?
Yeah. Well, I will always argue that Liverpool is the capital of the North and that anything that's going to be a Wembley of the North should be in Liverpool. But look, I don't think that public money should be used on this. I think that you can get redevelopment, I think you can get economic growth with private investment. And if there's, you know, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, the Mayor of Liverpool City region works with private partners, they can bring that investment in. And I've got to agree with the point about, you know, the people who own these clubs are billionaires. I think the Glazers are worth £4 billion. We shouldn't be subsidising that.
OK, I'm afraid that's the final whistle. We're out of time. Thank you to my guests. We hope to see you next month. Good night.